Before we begin, take a second to tell me where you're watching from and what kind of history stories you want more of. Frontline battles, home front survival, or the quiet moral choices people made when the war was supposed to explain everything. Like this video if human stories from World War II matter to you, and subscribe for more deep dives into moments the textbooks barely touch. The final year of the Pacific War smelled like smoke and hunger. Along the Japanese coast, firestorms rolled through fishing towns night after night as B-29 bombers droned overhead, their engines vibrating through the bones of a starving empire. In burned-out cities, women in tattered uniforms picked through the ashes of ration depots for anything that might still burn, anything that might still be edible. Once they had been nurses, typists, school teachers. Now they were soldiers without weapons, servants of a dying cause. Faces pale from malnutrition, lips cracked from saltless rice, hands too weak to steady themselves. Their bodies had learned to live without, and then learned it so long they could barely remember what hunger felt like when it was new. Tokyo's official ration had dropped below 500 calories a day, and even that number mostly lived on paper. On Saipan, where the war had chewed the land into dust, a 26-year-old volunteer nurse named Midori Tanaka crouched behind a field hospital tent trying to light a damp cigarette with shaking hands. Around her, the hospital was a canvas skeleton, filled with wounded men who were never going home. Flies arrived faster than orderlies could chase them away. American shells fell with a drumbeat regularity that seemed to have no end. The ground shook like the ocean. Each day, Midori boiled rice water for men whose stomachs could no longer take food. She hadn't seen meat in 6 months. Her uniform hung loose on her frame and was cinched with rope. When the radio finally crackled with the last command, "Fight to the end or die honorably," she turned the dial off and let the silence ring. Surrender did not exist in her world. From childhood, she'd been told the captivity was worse than death. Propaganda films and pamphlets showed Americans as towering devils who drank blood and laughed over corpses. But when the gunfire faded and the imperial flag was torn down, Midori didn't find death waiting. She found a quiet so total it made her ears hum. She crawled out from under the fallen tent, expecting a rifle muzzle and a shout. Instead, she saw men in olive drab handing out canteens. She wasn't alone. Thousands like her were captured across the Pacific in the summer of 1944 and into 1945. Clerks and typists and civilian volunteers who had followed the Imperial Army to the Philippines and the Marianas. Many were barely out of their teens. They carried sewing needles, diary fragments, and photographs of brothers already months dead. They expected torture. Instead, they were counted, searched, given water, treated for lice by medics who spoke gently through interpreters. Some wept because it was too confusing not to. Others spat and held back tears, certain this kindness was only the prelude to something worse. By early 1945, American victory was inevitable. What wasn't inevitable was what came next. The logistics of humane captivity. The U.S. Army had over 300,000 Japanese prisoners of war in its control, a fraction of whom were women. Washington ordered that those women be separated from men and sent to controlled camps in Hawaii and the mainland, partly for medical reasons, partly to abide by the Geneva Convention and demonstrate publicly that America's moral authority did not look like Japan's. War Department memoranda called it discipline through decency, a phrase that would feel strange as winter turned to spring. The journeys to camp were their own trials, packed on transport ships that had once ferried the wounded. The women slept beside barrels of disinfectant and crates of rations they were not allowed to touch. The ocean air burned their lungs after years of breathing through oxygen masks during air raids. Some prayed. Others stared at the horizon as if they could memorize the shape of exile. At Pearl Harbor, they disembarked into the kind of scene they couldn't have imagined. American nurses, military police, a line of cots. They were deloused, issued khaki, given medical exams. Doctors wrote numbers into ledgers. Average weight, 90 pounds. One former clerk wrote later in her diary, "I thought America would kill us. Instead, they gave us soap." Inside the wire, wooden barracks lined up like obedient soldiers beneath the flag they'd been raised to hate. Loudspeakers played swing for the guards. To the women, it sounded like the radio from another planet. The first morning at Camp McCoy Annex, the mess bell rang, and the air filled with a smell that hurt almost as much as the bombs. Bacon, yeast, coffee, something sweet. For months their noses had known only mildew and blood, unwashed skin and rice water, boiled to nothing. In the mess hall, the trays held scrambled eggs, white bread, a thin slice of ham, a tin cup of coffee with sugar. The tables were clean. Discipline was expected, but no one yelled. Midori reached for her fork and dropped it. The tiny sound of the fork pinging against the floor made heads turn. She whispered apologies, though no one had scolded her. A U.S. sergeant noticed a woman hesitate, took a bite from his own plate, nodded as if to say, "It's food." Within days, the stomachs that had forgotten how to digest fat and protein relearned. Within weeks, the menu became routine: bread, meat, canned fruit, tomatoes, milk. The colors returned to the women's faces. Laughter started to move between the barracks, soft and uncertain at first, like a song someone was trying to remember. But at night, when the generators hummed and the floodlights carved sharp shadows across the wire, Midori sat near the fence and stared at the dark line of palm trees. She wondered whether Tokyo still stood, whether her mother was alive, whether the empire she had served now lived only in ashes. In whispers, the women spoke of home, of lost fiancés, of survival. None of them called themselves prisoners aloud. The word sounded too final, too heavy for mouths that hadn't eaten properly in years. The American guards were careful. A few had fought in the Pacific and had seen what Japanese units had done to Allied POWs. But orders were orders. Treat these women with dignity. Doctors charted vitals weekly. Medical officers noted weight gain and vitamin recovery with clinical pride. In time, the camp settled into a strange equilibrium, half hospital, half waiting room for futures no one could picture. Outside the barbed wire, cities turned to cinders. Hiroshima and Nagasaki vanished in white fire. Inside, paradoxically, life returned. The women sewed curtains from scrap cloth, painted flowers on barracks walls, and swapped English phrases for Japanese with the guards. "Good morning," they said, bowing slightly. The Americans smiled awkwardly and mimicked the words. Mercy didn't erase the fence, but it softened the day. In mid-June, a camp doctor scribbled into his logbook, "Average weight gain, 3.5 pounds per week. Remarkable vitality." A nurse named Reiko laughed as she stepped on the scale. "I used to dream of weighing this much," she said, half ashamed, half delighted. Each morning, the mirror turned into a confessional. Women pinched their arms, examined their faces, marveling at cheeks that had rounded, hair that had gone glossy again. "Soft again," Reiko said, and everyone laughed with that brittle joy all recoveries share. The daily weigh-in quickly became a ritual of astonishment. The scale's numbers exposed something unthinkable. The enemy wasn't just keeping them alive, the enemy was restoring them. The irony hurt in a way that hunger didn't. Yet the warmth it carried was undeniable. America's medical officers called it nutritional rehabilitation. The women called it rebirth. Midori volunteered to translate at the infirmary. It kept her busy, and more importantly, it let her stand near the procedures she watched the American doctors perform with steady hands. Captain Lawrence, the chief physician, spoke with precise vowels and kept a pocket notebook like a man who wanted to remember everything. "They were our enemies last year," he said to Midori one afternoon, adjusting his glasses. "Now I worry if they skip lunch. War makes strange doctors of us all." She nodded and felt the sentence settle into her ribs. His kindness disarmed her more effectively than any weapon. A Red Cross representative arrived in July with photographers in tow. Women in neatly pressed reissued uniforms stood beside tomato vines they had planted themselves. The photographs would appear in U.S. newspapers a week later under captions like, "Enemy women regain health under U.S. care." To Americans, the images proved something important. The United States honored the Geneva Convention and could feed its enemies without losing itself. To the women, the presence of cameras made their bodies feel like propaganda. "By both sides," Reiko whispered to Midori after the pictures. Midori said nothing. She didn't need to. Camp life rustled along. Guards shared cigarettes. Prisoners taught origami. Radio static delivered swing in the afternoon and news bulletins at dusk. The language became a truce. Private Jenkins, a farm boy who looked too young for the lines around his eyes, practiced Japanese from a phrase book. "Watashi wa tomodachi desu," he said, stilted. "I am your friend." The women answered with shy English, "Thank you. Please." and then turned to each other and collapsed into giggles at the absurdity of it all. Still, guilt clung like heat. When one woman laughed too loudly at a joke a guard made, another squeezed her arm. "We are still enemies," she murmured. At night, some wrote letters to families they weren't sure were alive. Others wrote nothing at all, as if silence was the only honest language left. By August, the air in Hawaii hung like a curtain. The guards spoke in quieter voices. The radios turned up. Captain Lawrence stood outside the infirmary one afternoon, staring beyond the wire. "Something happened," he said in English without looking at Midori. "In Japan, 2 cities." He didn't say the names right away. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. He didn't need to. The air itself seemed to stop. That night, the women didn't sleep. They prayed, not for victory, not for revenge, but for the unknown dead, whose shadows now lay literally burned into the earth. Days later came a voice that no one in the camp had ever heard, thin and trembling and impossibly far away. The Emperor, the surrender. "Endure the unendurable," he said. The women froze where they stood. Tears rose without permission. When the broadcast ended, the compound remained still. Some fell to their knees. Others stared into nothing. Midori touched the mirror where she had been watching herself recover and saw not victory or defeat, but the outline of who survival had made her. "We endured," she whispered. The war's end wasn't the end of the story. Now came the part no one had drilled for, going home. The sea between Hawaii and Japan lay glass smooth under a sun that made the decks glow. The ships carried women who no longer belonged anywhere. Their bodies were heavier, their hearts were maybe lighter, their eyes reluctant. America dissolved into mist behind them, a land that had fed them into fullness against all logic. Ahead waited a homeland that was gaunt and silent, its soil still hot from the ash of surrender. On deck, a sailor pressed an apple into Midori's hand. "For peace," he said, and smiled because he couldn't think of anything else to say. She bowed shallowly and bit. The sweetness startled her. Fruit tasted like something too kind to exist after such a war. Rumors traveled across the waves faster than the ships. Tokyo was rubble. The Emperor still lived. Those who had surrendered were spat on in the street. Families disowned the ones who came back. Reiko tried to smile. "Maybe they'll forgive us for being alive," she said, and her hands shook. The dock smelled of ruin. Thin men in straw sandals, children barefoot, widows in black. As the ship approached, Midori felt the eyes already narrowing. The handover was quiet. American officers bowed. Japanese officials bowed lower. American boots polished to mirror finish. Japanese officials in worn uniforms and woven sandals. 2 different worlds meeting in one place. One side fed, the other starved. "You look well," the Japanese interpreter told Midori without meeting her eyes. It wasn't a compliment. The newspapers found the women almost immediately. Photographs, round faces, Western-style posture, American shoes, ran above headlines about well-fed prisoners. Editorials asked ugly questions. While the homeland starved, these women had feasted in enemy comfort. Their bodies, so recently emaciated and now restored, were used as evidence of betrayal. In a nation rebuilt on humiliation, their survival looked indecent. Midori went to live with distant relatives outside Yokohama. Food was scarce. Soap and shoes could be traded for rice. Her aunt's greeting cut worse than hunger. "You're too healthy." Children ran behind her whispering "American woman," as if the words were dirty. She opened her suitcase one morning and took out the bar of U.S. Army issue soap that Captain Lawrence had tucked into her belongings with a note, "For your health. Stay well," and set it back without using it. It wasn't guilt. It was something more complicated. The knowledge that the most consistent kindness during the war had come from the side that won. Across Japan, female POWs faced the same cold reception. Police interrogated some, suspecting collaboration. Hospitals refused to rehire others. Ration offices turned them away. Official records barely mentioned their captivity. Their existence didn't fit the narrative. Women who had lived through defeat and found compassion from the wrong hands were inconvenient shadows in the public story. Letters arrived sporadically through the Red Cross. One was addressed to Midori in careful English. "The garden you planted still grows. We remember you." No signature. She knew. The image came to her as clearly as a photograph. Captain Lawrence kneeling by the tomato vines she had watered, turning a leaf between his fingers, wondering whether he should write more and deciding to keep it simple. She found work in a small clinic treating malnourished children and survivors of the firebombed neighborhoods. Her hands, soft again for a moment in Hawaii, grew rough. She weighed infants who were more bone than baby, mixed powdered milk with trembling hands, whispered comfort in the same words an American nurse had once said to her. There, you will live. The sentence felt foreign and true at the same time. Spring of 1946 arrived, with cold rain and small mercies. Much of the weight she had gained disappeared, but not the lesson. When she stood in front of the mirror now, Midori saw a woman built out of contradiction, fed by enemies, starved by home, somehow still whole. Reiko visited thinner than before, but smiling. We survived 2 wars, she said, the one on the maps and the one in our hearts. Midori laughed softly, and then they both cried. One evening, as rain whispered on the clinic roof, Midori took out the note again. For your health, stay well. The ink had faded. The words hadn't. She set it next to a candle and whispered in hesitant English, I did. Beyond the clinic, the streets sparkled with rain. Somewhere, a child laughed. After all the speeches and the silence, after the ration cards and the rope belts, mercy lingered like an echo the war couldn't kill. It wasn't the kind of victory any nation could claim for itself. It belonged to people, the guard with the harmonica who learned good morning, the nurse who traded a ribbon for a smile, the woman who saw her face in a mirror and understood that mercy can be a weapon and a healing at the same time. History calls it the Pacific War, the Geneva Convention, prisoner repatriation. She called it living long enough to learn that compassion has no nationality. If this story stayed with you, tell me what moment struck hardest. The mess hall eggs after years of saltless rice, the radio voice announcing surrender, the apple offered for peace, or the cold reception that waited at the docks. Like the video, share it with someone who loves World War II history told through human lives, and subscribe for more stories the war left behind in letters, diaries, and the quiet places where people decided who they were going to be when the guns went silent.